Hi everyone, my name is Zuhaib. In this tutorial, we will discuss the additional utilities dialog and its utilities for the grid and other layer types. It offers a handful of utilities to perform different actions on the grid to make your workflow faster. We start with the first section, which is grid utilities. You can select one or more grid layers and it will detect the whole grid automatically. The first option is select whole grid. If we click this, then it will select the whole grid. It will also ask if it finds any locked layers to unlock them first. If we click on no, then only unlocked layers will be selected. If we click again, and this time we click yes, then it will unlock all the layers and will select them all. You can now pre-comp grid, delete whole grid or perform any other action which is required. With the delete whole grid button, you can delete the whole grid with all its layers and controllers even if layers are locked. I lock the layers again to show. Now if we select one grid layer and click on delete whole grid button, you can see it has deleted the whole grid. The next option is center anchor points, which helps to center the anchor point for all the grid layers. Also, when you created the grid, it centers the anchor points automatically to position the items correctly. But later, if you made any changes to the contents of any layer, especially for the text and shape layers, for demonstration purposes, I have this demo grid with all the layers fitting inside their frames. Now if I move this ball in this shape layer and change its position, you can see its anchor point didn't change and the layer is no longer in the center of its frame. It is calculating the fitting correctly but not the position due to the anchor point shift. In the same way, if we edit this text and add a new line at the bottom, it is also not in the center anymore. The same will happen if you apply any shape modifiers from this menu or text animators on the text layer. I have added a repeater already and animated the position of shapes. If I move the time indicator, you can see shape copies are going outside the frame. So after making these changes, you need to click on this button by selecting any grid layer. It will recalculate all the anchor points as static values, but it will not be enough if shapes are animating when we move through the timeline. It will also remove any keyframes for anchor points and will disable the expressions found on these. You can also use the native After Effects shortkey Ctrl-Alt-Home or Command-Option-Home to center these, but it won't work with keyframes or if there are any expressions. There is also another option in this button which is Apply by Expression. You need to hold Ctrl or Command key when clicking to apply. It will apply the expressions on the anchor points properties, which will always keep the anchor points in the center, no matter if we make any changes to the layer's contents. Let's check again with repeater. You can see if the position changes, it will center automatically. Then if we add a third line in the text layer, it centers automatically as well. And if we add a text animator, I already added one with position set to -500 and just animated the end value from 0 to 100. You can see it will always stay in the center now. I would only recommend using this Apply by Expressions option if you need to animate the shapes or text layers or modify its content frequently, as it will require extra calculation on your system along with the other expressions in your grid or the project. You can click this button again without using Ctrl or Command and it will remove these expressions and will apply the static values again. Let's go back to the previous composition. The next option is Swap Selected Layers, and as the name suggests, it helps to reshuffle the order of the grid layers. The first option, Reverse Order, will reverse selected grid layers in the order you have selected these. We can select two or more layers from anywhere in the grid to reverse or swap. To select these conveniently directly from the composition viewer, you need to log your feature layers first if unlocked, so they won't come in the way. You can also log those using this Log Feature Layers button. So now let's say if we select grid layers with indices 10, 11 and 12. I'm selecting these in order just to show clearly how it works, but you can select layers at any position in the grid. If we click on Swap Selected Layers button, you can see it reverses the layers in the order we have selected these. The last selected item is moved to the first position and the first one is moved to the end. Same way, if we select now 2 layers, you can see these have been swapped easily. The second option in this button is Change Sequence as Selected. That is also very useful and it will sort the grid items in the order you have selected these, but within the frames of these selected items. Let's say if we want to change the order of these 4 layers. I also have added some numbers to these to use as a reference for the purpose of this video. I hid those layers using visibility option of bulk edit dialog. I restored those back by going into the bulk edit dialog. You can learn more about the bulk edit dialog by watching its tutorial on the product page. Now you can see these numbers from 1 to 4. We want to arrange these items in this order inside these frames. So select these in the same sequence. Let's say we want to see this layer with drone footage first. Then on the second number this ocean one. Then on the third we choose this one with some mountains and this title slide at the end. Now if we hold Ctrl or Command and click on Swap Selected Layers button, you can see how smartly it changed these layer sequence in the exact selected order, which was first, second, third and fourth within their selected frames. To continue on the next option, I hide these numbers again by going into Bulk Edit dialog. Using the visibility method, set index to 2 to target image layers as they are at the second position and click on this Change Visibility button. The next option is Revert Grid, which will dissolve the grid and will release all its layers with their original transform values. You can see it removed all feature layers and controllers as well, and we are left with these layers or compositions only. And as this item had position keyframes before adding to the grid, those were preserved. If the grid was freezed or baked before, then their original values had been overridden, and when reverted, they will have the last freezed or baked values instead. I undo that and move to the next option. Release from grid. It allows to release only selected layers from the grid, so they are no longer part of the grid. For example, if you select these layers and click on the button, you can see they have been released from the grid and now showing outside as separate layers. I undo all steps I made. The next option is Convert to 3D. It is helpful if you want to convert the grid layers to 3D for any reason. It is also helpful for the zoom feature of the grid to work properly. I have added some keyframes to zoom this layer here. You can see other layers will show on top of this as per the layer order in the layers panel. But if we convert all layers to 3D, then no matter what layer you zoom, it will always show on top of other layers. In the same way, we can convert the grid back to 2D using this Convert to 2D button, or if we don't want to use 3D features anymore. The log feature layers allows you to log all feature layers including masks, strokes and backgrounds. It is helpful as you don't need to edit these manually and can animate these from the controller easily. So this way they won't distract while working or selecting the main grid items for checking their indices or swapping their positions, etc. By the way, these layers are locked already when you add them. If you want to unlock all of these feature layers for any purpose, then you can use this button Unlock Features Layers to do it automatically. For this grid, we just have masks that are locked and not have added other feature layers. So all mask layers are unlocked. To lock these back, we can use Lock Feature Layers button. And these all are locked again. The next option, Default Layers Visibilities and States, will restore the default visibility states for all the grid layers, which includes their layer visibilities, label colors, solo, shy, and lock states, etc. Let's see if we change some of these randomly. Then when we click this button, they will be reset to their default states. The next section is for freezing or baking the grid. Freeze grid will convert the grid expressions to static values using its values at the current time. It could be helpful if you want to freeze the grid temporarily when you are working on a heavy project or don't want to animate the grid so their expressions won't be calculated while working or rendering. The first option also keeps keyframes, will retain all keyframes if existed on any grid layer's property, and will apply expressions to make it freeze using a static value so it doesn't change. This layer has keyframes on its position before it was added to the grid, but these won't work due to the grid expressions. So if we freeze the grid now, then all properties without keyframes have static calculated values, and this one has expression with that static calculated value. This way it won't move to keep it freezed. There is another option, also remove keyframes, that will remove all the keyframes and expressions from all properties. To show that, I unfreeze it first. Now if we use freeze with its removing keyframes function, it will just have static values now, and it removed the keyframe from this position property as well. So you can easily animate the grid manually if you want. Let's unfreeze again. Bake Grid allows you to bake the grid animation by converting all expressions to keyframes. There are two baking methods available. The first one is Bake Accurate, which is slow because it detects the value changes on all grid properties over time, and it will add keyframes where required. It may take longer to calculate if there are many grid layers with all their features added. Bake Accurate also has some additional settings to set the calculation area limits. If you enable all three, then the calculation area will be shorter. Limit to work area will limit the calculation within the composition's work area. And limit to layer duration will limit the calculation between the layers in and out points for an individual grid layer. Because the calculations on the controller layer are happening throughout the composition, and it will disregard in and out points of the individual grid layer and will calculate and add keyframes throughout the composition if it is disabled. Let's say if we set these layers in and out points here, then if limit to layer duration is disabled, it will still check the area before and after the in and out points of the layer while taking into account the other selected limit options. So it is better to keep it checked. The next option is limit to comp duration, which will limit the calculation within the composition duration. It is helpful in case any of your layers in and out points go outside the composition, then they will be ignored. I have some keyframes on the offset property of the grid, so to bake it, I set the work area to cover only these keyframes. Then if I click bake, it will start the process within the selected range and will add keyframes where required. That's why layers are shifting, as they were there at the end of the work area and the next keyframes on the controller are ignored. You can see even though the value is changing within these keyframes, it ignored the area outside the layer in point. And also this area is empty as there is no value change. Let's undo it. The next baking method is Bake Optimum Experimental, which is fast but less accurate in some situations. I would recommend to try this one first and see how it works for you. The reason for it being less accurate is that it merges keyframes from different grid controller properties to the grid and feature layers' individual properties. For example, the position of the grid items is linked with different properties which include number of items, offset, position, fitting options, zoom, and some others. This way, if any of these properties have keyframes at the same time like this, then they can cause conflict with each other's easing. So when we merge these into a single position keyframe on the grid layer, it will use the easing of the last properties keyframe only. Also, if they exist at different positions in time, then it will produce extra keyframes on the grid position that may affect the overall easing, and you may need to fix these manually. If these properties don't have keyframes in the duration of other conflicted properties keyframes values, like if we move these further after the above property keyframes, then these will be baked correctly without any easing conflicts. This button will unfreeze or unbake the grid based on what was applied to it. It will reapply all the expressions to the grid and feature layers and will link them back with the grid controllers. The controller properties will take over control of all these properties values and will ignore any keyframes. It has 3 additional options. Also keeps keyframes will keep all keyframes on the individual layers while unfreezing or unbaking, like these baked ones. But values will be controlled by the controller properties instead. In also removes keyframes will remove any existing keyframes on baked or freezed grid properties while unfreezing or unbaking. The next one is force update expressions only, which will force update all grid expression even if it was not freezed or baked. It is helpful to fix any expression issues if some are not working or got messed up by mistake. Now, as we have discussed all the grid utilities, and below are some other utilities that can be applied on any other layer types. Fitting to comp section helps you to fit any selected layers to the composition according to these fitting options. To show that I have this composition with some images placed at random positions and have different sizes as well. We can fit all at the same time, but for now I am going to use the first one to demonstrate and hiding the other ones. The first option is fill the comb, which will fill the entire composition by scaling the layers proportionally and will push any extra pixels outside the composition boundary. Let's undo it. This option will fit selected layers to the composition boundary by scaling these proportionally. And if any from the width or height of a layer is not proportionally equal to the composition's width or height, then it will produce some empty area there. The next option will fit the layers by their widths to the composition width and will scale the height proportionally. And fit by height will fit the layers by their heights to the composition height and will adjust the width proportionally. Stretch to fit will stretch the layers to fit their widths and heights to the composition's width and height, and it won't maintain the proportions between width and height of the image. If you try on image 2, it will be more clear. You can see the image is stretched now. The last option will reset the original scale values of all selected layers by setting them back to 100 and will also remove any scale keyframes if existed. So now we have discussed these fitting options, but we had this checkbox move layer to center already enabled, which will also move the layers to the center while fitting. Otherwise it will not move the layer and will just adjust the scale of the layer. And if there are any keyframes found on the position of any layer, then they will move along with the layer. I have this layer at the end which also has position keyframes. If I click on any fitting option at this point in time, you can see the keyframes also moved relatively, as the center position value is calculated at the current time of the active composition, so if we change the time, then the layer may still get off the center due to these keyframes. If you don't want to retain position animation and always want to keep the layer in the center, then you need to remove these keyframes first. So guys, we have discussed all the additional utilities and I hope this tutorial was helpful. You can reach out for any further queries or help. Thanks for watching and see you later.